Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to gather us together because it's 9:32, and I have a lot to present this morning. And I know people come in and out, and that's fine. I want to let you know that next week we'll start Walter Brueggemann's study called Names for the Messiah. It will be Advent starting next week. Go figure. How did that happen? So next Sunday is our first Sunday in Advent, and the way I'm designing this is I will give you a little bit of talk first, and then each table will have a copy of this book, and you'll have some discussion leaders, one at each table. And the way he's designed this is it's for discussion and interactive dialogue. So each of your discussion leaders will have the questions, the discussion questions. If you want your own personal copy of this book, I'll be happy to order it for you. Just let me know after. Okay? But it's a very small, short, but very full book. Names for the Messiah. What do we call Jesus, the Messiah? So I look forward to doing that with you. Today my goal is to start with a teeny little wrap-up of last week, and then go into what it means, not just personally, but collectively, to respond as Christians to where we are now, post-election, as the president-elect is appointing members to his new administration and that kind of thing. Where do we go with each other? So in our time together these past couple of weeks, we've looked at our Christian identity in terms of covenant, community, and personal accountability. Last week was my goal. And last week we spent a good chunk of time with Stephen Carter. Paul told me he bought the book. Yay. It takes a little while, as Paul was saying, to kind of read through it and reflect on it a little bit, but it's an excellent book. And Stephen asked the important question of what is required for us to be not so much polite in our relating to one another, but democratic, small d. He believes that the etiquette of democracy requires civility. That's what we talked about last week, which he defines as the sum of all sacrifices we make in order to live a common life. He goes on to assert that the sacrifice that defines civility is a dialogue. Sacrifice is a dialogue that allows us to get to know other people. And he points to two aspects of this process of democratic, small d, dialogue, democratic dialogue. Two things that enable that to happen. One is the recognition that our own convictions are always contingent. By that he means we need to enter into dialogue with another open to the possibility that he or she might have a point. That he or she might be right. And the second follows along the principle of presumption of innocence. It's not just a legal term, it also enters into our dialogue with one another. It rests on an openness that believes the best and not the worst of the stranger, the other. The more we surround ourselves with people who think like we do, the stranger others who don't think like we do seem. The more we feel ourselves surrounded by strangers, the more our primitive emotions, we're wired this way, anxiety, fear, worry, sadness, and anger rule our behavior. Come on in. Come on in. So I want to play just the last 2 minutes of this clip because he kind of sums this up very nicely. I thought that was appropriate today. Okay, you can turn the light on for a minute. So, that is the end of Stephen Carter for now. He wrote another book called Integrity that we might look at later on, maybe in the spring, but on civility. So we've had a mandate handed to us by the election just passed, but it's not new. This is not new. And it's not a particularly political mandate. The mandate that has been handed to us is found in the Old Testament. It's carried into the New Testament, and it's repeated over and over by Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you. To move from behavior dominated by fear to behavior that gives itself over to relief, incredulity, elation, and surprise. To love our neighbors as ourselves. It sounds so simple, and it's so difficult. Carter says the issues we face are so divisive because they're so hard. So, presuming we agree that civility and democratic dialogue are important, how do we get ourselves to that place where we can commit to what he calls the sacrifice of civility, where we listen and seek to understand, even when someone is expressing views that are antithetical to our core beliefs? How do we do the countercultural thing? The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. That's out of Leviticus. To help guide us, I want to now turn to a man by the name of Parker Palmer. Has anyone heard of him? I know Mary probably has, and Sarah. Parker Palmer is an author, an educator. He's an activist from the Quaker tradition, and he focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. And he's the founder and senior partner of the Center for Courage and Renewal. And I'll show us this clip. Is called America, Hospitality, and Salvation. America, Hospitality, and Salvation. This is only about a 10-minute clip. But it may introduce a couple of ideas that you've not heard before. So, that's Parker Palmer. His thoughts. That was, of course, done before the election. Did you hear the question the cameraman asked in the background at the beginning of the clip? Can you guarantee the stranger won't take any of my stuff? He asked in a joking way, maybe. The cameraman was really good at prompting and bringing out, eliciting some of the questions that all of us ask, I think. Can you guarantee the stranger won't take any of my stuff? So who is the stranger? Do we know? Can you just call out who you think the stranger is? Who's the stranger to you? Who's the stranger?
The guy next door.
The guy next door. My guy next door is pretty much a stranger to me. I'll admit that. Anybody else?
Refugees.
Refugees?
A Muslim in the headscarf.
A Muslim? Anybody else?
The government.
The government is a stranger to a lot of us.
People in different parts of this country that we don't even know.
Okay?
Illegal immigrant.
An illegal immigrant is a stranger to a lot of us. Right?
People in prison.
People in prison are strangers to us.
People promoting things that I just don't think are true.
So they would appear as a stranger to you,
Yes.
or maybe their ideology is strange to you. Right. So I made a list just because I had nothing better to do. And I said, these folks were kind of strangers. The person who identifies as Democrat, the person who identifies as Republican, the person who's liberal, the person who's conservative, the person who's evangelical, the person who's progressive, the person who's American, the person who's Syrian. We are the stranger, are we not? To one another, even sitting around the same table, especially at this time in our collective history. Hebrews 13 says, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality, which is what Parker Palmer was talking about, to strangers. For by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. And from Romans 12, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, do what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and extend hospitality to strangers. That mandate for hospitality is throughout the scriptures. There's a neat little book that just came out in 2015 by Will Willimon, who's a good Methodist, called Fear of the Other. And that might be interesting for us to look at sometime, or you might want to order it yourself. But this is what he has to say about the stranger. He says, in light of Paul's testimony that I just read to you in Romans, an important function of Christian preaching and church life is to render me, us, into the other. I am the one who makes myself a stranger to my sisters and brothers. I am also the one who has received grace and revelation from the other. I have been the beneficiary of ministry from the other before I was able to receive that other, as Christ had received me. I was ministered to by the other who was kind enough to help me go where I avoided going. I'm going to read that again. I was ministered to by the other who was kind enough to help me go where I avoided going. And then he says, exclusionary fear of the other is more than a matter of preference for people with whom we enjoy hanging out or feel most comfortable. In deep fear of the other, we separate ourselves from others in order to better oppress, exploit, expulse, confine, hurt, or deny justice and access to others whom we have judged to be so other as to be beyond the bounds of having any bond with us or any claim upon us. And I think you probably heard Parker Palmer say, in debates about others, Christianity's default position is hospitality, even as we received hospitality on the cross of Christ. Yesterday, I put myself deliberately in a position where I was other. I went to a Shabbat service at Rydell Park. If you haven't been to Shabbat usually is practiced on Friday evening. It marks the close of the week in Judaism. It's a wonderful service on a Friday evening. They celebrate with grape juice and bread. The rabbi prays over the cup, the Kodesh cup, right? They serve challah. They pray. They remember the dead. It's a beautiful service. It defines a boundary on the work week, and then it marks the beginning of the Sabbath, which for them is Saturday. In the world of aging, we do things on the weekend because that's when synagogue and church staff are available. And so I was invited to go to Rydell Park and celebrate Shabbat with them. And we went through the whole service. And afterwards, I went up and talked to Rabbi Sussman for a few minutes. He said, "Well, where are you right now?" And I said, "Well, how do you mean that?" He said, "I mean physically, where are you in your work?" I said, "Well, I'm at this really neat place called Grace Presbyterian Church in Jenkintown." He said, "Oh, that's near Sunrise." I said, "Nope." I said, "It's next door to another community, a memory care community in Jenkintown, right on Old York Road." He said, "Okay." So we went around for a few minutes. He said, "How did you like Shabbat?" And I said, "Oh, I love Shabbat. I've been before." I said, "But you have an advantage over me because you get to practice your Hebrew every day, and I only get to draw mine out maybe once or twice a year, and it's very rusty." He said, "No, I mean, were you comfortable here?" And I said, "Yes, I was." I said, "Everyone was really nice to a Gentile, right?" So I was the stranger in that situation. The Goyim came into the room, right? That was me. It was a wonderful celebration together. And no one said, "What are you doing here?" They just welcomed me into their presence. They extended hospitality to me, the stranger. Hospitality is that safe space where we discover we have more in common than not. Once we begin to define who we are as Christians apart from who we are as Grace Presbyterian Church or Americans, and understand hospitality as a core virtue, we can begin to move toward creating that safe space. What would that look like here? I'm going to throw out a question. It's not rhetorical. I really want to know, what would that look like here to create a safe space? So Parker Palmer gave us sort of a template for doing that. He asked, who are the stakeholders in this community? So who would some of the stakeholders be in this Jenkintown community if we wanted to do this? We wanted to create a space for communication and dialogue. What would they do? Marcia?
I think in a lot of ways, we're already doing that with community groups.
Okay.
They are very diverse at our church.
So, do you think kids have an easier time with this?
Yes.
And why do you think that is?
Yeah, they don't have as much background, they don't have as much baggage.
They want ideologues.
They're together in school a lot of times.
And I think sometimes I'm surprised at all the number of kids that actually come because most of them don't have a lot of religious background, but I think the parents are glad for them to come mostly because it's a safe space for them to be. The religion part is probably something they don't sort of
Okay.
think about.
So, do you think the parents are stakeholders?
Probably.
Okay. Who else in this community? Because not all parents belong to this church.
Oh, no,
Right.
no. Even those that belong don't necessarily come.
Mm-hmm. I know. Who else would be a stakeholder in the community here? That would be someone you would think to invite into a dialogue time.
Salem Baptist.
Salem Baptist Church, yes. So, how many of us have a working understanding and familiarity with that church? Yeah. And yet, if we went there, we would be welcomed with open arms. Right. It just happens that in the mornings I swim with a woman who's a member there, and we have a lot of conversations, and especially recently about race and some of the things that have been said and what it means to her and what it means to me. We both grew up in Abington. We were in the same class in school. We didn't know it then. We know it now, but we had very different upbringings in Abington schools. So it's so interesting that how far is Salem Baptist Church from Grace Church? You could walk there in 5 minutes. That's a wonderful suggestion. So someone from the African American worshiping community at Salem Baptist Church. Some parents. Who else? Who else would it be important to invite in here?
People next door.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Someone from, is it Chelsea? I think. Someone from the older adult population, right? I have to tell you from working for a couple of years with older adults, they have a lot of opinions about what we could be doing better in the world, and a lot of experience to back that up. So they're not uninvested. They want to have a voice. I think that's a great idea.
Some of them there, it's vital.
And bridal, absolutely.
And the senior citizens at many of the Catholic churches in the community.
The Catholic Church, we have one of the largest Catholic churches right down the street, right? So we have Catholic, Baptist, different races, right? I mentioned one a minute ago. Who was that?
Lots of synagogues.
Synagogues, right? How many synagogues do we have on York Road? Right? Temple Judea, Beth Shalom, KI,
AJ.
just AJ, just go right down the York Road corridor. The idea is to get the different folks who are invested in the community, the larger community, who typically don't have a lot to do with one another, to sit down together at the table and have this kind of intentional dialogue, right? To start breaking down some of the walls. And yes, it's difficult. That's kind of the point, is to have a series of difficult conversations on issues that affect all of us. Those speeders on Old York Road, right? We could all have something to say about that. That's a safe place to start. And you go from there. Who's invested in the community and who's invested in going forward? I'm going to close us with a reference to an openness that believes the best and not the worst of the stranger. In his book entitled A Public Faith, How the Followers of Jesus Christ Should Serve the Common Good, Miroslav Volf says, we need to cultivate a hermeneutic, that's a fancy word for a way we interpret human behavior. We need to cultivate a hermeneutic of hospitality. In contrast to the popular hermeneutic of suspicion, where we expect something sinister beneath the surface of the other, hospitality accepts the other's self-presentation, who they are, looking for good in the other, and makes judgments, interprets, and assesses with an openness engendered by our knowledge of God's basic stance toward humanity. In short, we make believe we're hospitable, so that by God's grace we believe the promises of God and live what we profess. The church gives us experiences just threatening enough to enable us to experiment with new ways of living without being so threatened that we're paralyzed by fear. So think about that. So I love your ideas. Next week, Sandy's going to allow me to preach. And you'll hear some of these ideas reflected again to the larger congregation. I really appreciate your time and your investment and your energy around this. And I really think, judging by that and the numbers we've had, it would be good not to let it go. And so I hope in the future we can talk a little bit more about what safe space for guided conversations might look like with adults, right? Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, and I'll see you next week for our Advent study.
Be more hospitable.